Schmozzle. Interesting word, isn't it? Schmozzle. A mess. A total mess. Trying to unscramble eggs. Ever tried to unscramble scrambled eggs? Well, you can't unscramble scrambled eggs. And that's what we're finding with the current so-called energy crisis in this country. It's obvious, and the key word is obvious, the current energy crisis is totally related, directly related to the privatisation of this country's energy production, distribution and sales. Totally obvious. But most people in authority refuse to acknowledge this basic fact. When you allow private entities which are dependent on creating a profit for their owners and shareholders to dominate and take over and own essential services, this is what happens. Now in the 1990s, when privatisation became the new mantra in this country and around the world, we saw the private sector flock and buy at ridiculously low prices nationalised assets. Now nationalised assets have two functions. One is to provide essential services, and two, to provide a mechanism via which to create revenue for Treasury at the state and federal level. The greater the level of privatisation, the more dependent the state and federal government, the state governments and the federal government becomes on taxing individuals and businesses and everyday activities. Because privatising essential services, which always create a profit for Treasury, whether the profit is in terms of stability as far as energy supply is concerned, stability as far as price fluctuation is concerned, stability in terms of having some direct input on government regarding inefficient or outdated services or addressing the issue of climate emergency. But now we find ourselves in the situation, faced with a climate emergency, where these essential services are owned by a myriad of companies, not one company, but a myriad of companies. And then we see the governments at the state and federal level introduced all these regulatory bodies in an attempt to ensure that energy supplies continue to be produced at a reasonable cost. Now we've seen this problem in all aspects of Australian society. We saw it during the COVID-19 crisis, which continues, where we didn't actually have the resources of a Commonwealth Serum Laboratory in public hands, where we had to go cap in hand to a privatised serum laboratory, give them $1 billion, and then find that we've backed the wrong horse as far as AstraZeneca was concerned. And the list goes on and on. Even Centrelink is a classic example of what happens when you privatise an essential services, and the leaving the private sector to dominate that area of trying to find work for Australians has led to the rorts which we continue to see on a daily basis. And even when we have things like the National Disability Insurance Scheme, which theoretically is in public hands, its major function is to outsource services to the private sector. And no wonder the cost blows out consistently. So is there an alternative to nationalisation as far as energy production is concerned. Is there an alternative to privatisation? And there is an alternative, which nobody's willing to look at, people who have the power to ensure this occurs. The alternative is community-public partnerships. Not private-public partnerships, not privatisation where the whole kit and caboodle is given across to the private sector, but community-public partnerships to create decentralised energy sources across the country. So that when there is an emergency, it is located in a specific area, not the whole East Coast or the whole of the country, because of decisions which have been made by governments which haven't taken into account the fact that we need energy. It's simple. A 21st century society needs energy, and whether it's renewable, whether it's fossil fuel, whether it sticks in a fire, the fact is human beings have always needed energy. It is critical. It's the same situation we see in the privatisation of water in this country, making water a commodity. Another disaster, not in the making, but a disaster right now in terms of deciding how to return water back to our major waterways, because the private sector continues to clamour for its pound of flesh. So whether it's energy or water. So what is a community-public partnership? It's a partnership where the public sector provides finance to community organisations to create energy systems for specific localities. It can be done in an urban centre, it can be done in regional centres. We saw something like this during the Whitlam-led government, where community health centres, the community radio stations, were established around the country. And they were established around the country on the basis of communities setting up committees and organisations in order to establish community health centres, community radio stations. As far as community radio stations were concerned, the government provided the licence, paid for the licence. As far as community health centres were concerned, the government paid for the infrastructure and continued to pay for personnel until even they, most of them, were privatised, although a few still continue to exist. So again, we can have decentralised systems. And the beauty of a decentralised system is not the whole of the country is impacted by a crisis, as we saw, or as we continue to see during this cold winter, regarding provision of energy. When you have a centralised, privately owned resource, if there is an issue, then it affects the whole country, or most of the country. So it's a real thing, decentralised, community-specific, public-community partnerships. It can be done in terms of public housing, it can be done in terms of water, it can be done in terms of energy, it can be done in reference to access to land. So it's a different way of looking at things. Today, we see the $2 trillion that are invested in superannuation, which is basically pension fund when people get older, pension fund they pay for themselves. We see these hundreds of billions of dollars being invested in the private sector. As the stock market continues to fall, all these people who felt they had this golden, secure nest egg for their retirement are beginning to understand that their retirement is totally dependent on the vagaries of the stock market, because over 50% of every dollar in superannuation funds has gone into the stock market. And as we saw during the crisis almost 20 years ago, what can happen overnight? These are not secure funds, and although returns have been very good over the last decade, we may find that returns are going to be exceptionally bad during the next decade. It's an extraordinary situation we find ourselves in, where basic tenets, basic facts that everybody has known, that historically we have seen occur over and over and over again, all these lessons have been lost. Why do you think governments in the 20th century set up public institutions to provide essential services? Because it was quite obvious that the private sector, whether it was railways, whether it was electricity, whether it was other forms of energy, whether it was healthcare, the private sector, which is based on the mantra of private investment for private profit, cannot provide essential services in a timely manner. So through strikes and occupations and revolts and revolutions and rebellions during the 19th century, the state was forced to take on the ownership of essential services in order to provide security to its citizens. Now, it's all very well for the state to talk about that it needs to provide external security from foreign intervention and invasion, but another important aspect of the state is to provide essential services, not centralised essential services which are owned by the private sector, or even nationalised, publicly owned, centralised essential services, but essential services which are community focused, community based, which form community public partnerships. And there's nothing more important than decentralisation as far as critical services are concerned. So the last 40 years, during the deregulation, privatisation, globalisation, corporatisation revolution, we have learnt nothing. When money was being created out of thin air, when governments and people forget lessons of the past, we repeat the mistakes of the past. For example, as I kept saying, I just said, all this money being created out of thin air. Now, obviously, during the 20s and 30s, we saw the consequences of this type of economic policies, and we saw the extreme poverty, the wiping out of the middle classes, especially in Europe, the rise of fascism as the middle class lost its financial stability, and we saw the consequences of these policies resulting in World War II. And the situation is eerily familiar today. We have a situation of this money coming out of thin air. We now have inflation. Anybody with one synapse in neuron in their brain would realise this type of policy would create inflation. It's not about the Ukrainian war. It's not about the Russian intervention of Ukraine, the inflation. It's a direct response to the economic and monetary system we have been supporting over the past few decades. Obviously, the Russian invasion has pushed it a little bit further, but that's not the issue. The central issue is the fact that if you flood the market with money, you will create inflationary pressures. And I think anybody in Australia who has a mortgage or owns a home understands what inflationary pressures do. although we haven't had general inflation in this country for a number of years, we have had housing inflation. Property prices have increased by over 30 times since the early 1970s. Wages haven't increased by over 30 times. We've seen the privatisation of the housing market by the destruction of the public housing sector by various governments, especially the Victorian state government, which has been on a trajectory of privatising every public house in the state and continues to foment policies to transfer the management of these homes to the private sector. We do find ourselves in a very difficult situation today. And the first thing we need to do is we need to think outside the box we have put ourselves in. Because if there is economic instability, if there is a lack of essential services, discontent increases in the community, and as discontent increases, we have a recipe for the creation of authoritarian regimes. It's no accident that authoritarian regimes are seizing the moment across the world. It's no accident that representative democracy is being sent into oblivion. Representative democracy has been digging its own grave since the beginning of the 20th century. It has allowed those people with money to dominate the electoral process. It has created disillusionment in the general population regarding the value of representative democracy because it is never able to deliver. The colours of the people in the parliament may change, the colours of the political parties may change, but the agenda is the same. And we're seeing that with the Albanese-led Labor government, which is not even willing to intervene in the current gas crisis because they still subscribe to the privatisation, corporatisation, deregulation, globalisation agenda. Because we see that Parliament today is not a reflection of the will of the people, it's a reflection of the political forces in this country which own the means of production, distribution, exchange and communication. That's what Parliament has become. So no wonder authoritarian figures are being able to impose their will on large sections of the world's societies because of the failure of representative democracy. And representative democracy will always fail because it is based on the concept of the person with the most money, the person with the most influence, will continue to dominate the parliamentary agenda. It doesn't matter who's voted into power, it's the parliamentary agenda which is important. If that parliamentary agenda never changes, then nothing changes. So we do find ourselves in a difficult situation. We've lost the ability to generate income for the population through publicly owned essential services. We are seeing the marketplace dominated by private institutions who are based on the concept of private investment for private profit, who need to maximise profits at ever increasing rates for their major shareholders as money flows from one business to another, to another, to another, to another, taking no consequence. The investment market never takes any consequence of the reality. We're told it's all about reality. Look at all these so-called gig companies which don't make a profit but which demand extraordinary prices, although we are now seeing the stock market starting to correct itself. So we are in a difficult situation. So I can stand here for the next 1,000 years, 2,000 years, 100,000 years and talk about this situation, but unless the situation changes rapidly, unless we look at things that are a little bit different, things like direct democracy, Things like community public partnerships, things like the reintroduction of decentralised, publicly owned assets to provide for the basic needs of human people. Unless we are willing to change the mantra, unless we are willing to change, go on to the next chapter, we will continue to make the same mistakes. History is a good indication of in the direction in which we are going. And if inflation leads to hyperinflation, the rise of authoritarian figures and authoritarian regimes in so-called democratic states which are based on representative democracy will increase. And possibly it may lead to World War III, which will make World War II look like a picnic. We see the sabre rattling, whether it's in Russia invading the Ukraine, whether it's the United States attempting to drag Australia into a military alliance to confront China. If we're not careful, we'll find ourselves as the Ukraine of the South Pacific. Independent foreign policy, independent economic policy, the breakdown of corporatisation, the reversal of privatisation, and the reintroductions of regulations which protect people from the private investment for private profit brigade is essential if we are to change the direction this society is heading in.